Hey everybody, welcome to Bible class once again. I hope that you're having a good day, and I know that it has been hot this week. But today we're going to keep talking about Paul and his missionary journeys. We talked about that on Sunday, and you had a map that you could go and you could follow along. We're going to have a similar map today, but this one's going to outline his second missionary journey. Remember, there were three. So the first one was on Sunday, this is the second one. So one of the things that we learn on his first missionary journey is that he gets a new name. We know him on the first time we see him as Saul of Tarsus, which is actually a Jewish name. If you remember in the Old Testament in 1 Samuel, there was a king called Saul. It's a Jewish name. And now we know him as Paul, which is a Roman name. And it's not necessarily uncommon that a man would change his name as he got older like that. So now we know him as a Roman name, and he is now going and speaking to the Gentiles, and he ultimately wants to go to Rome. So it makes sense that he would go by a Roman name. So this missionary journey, again, it's not always real easy to tell which years they take place on, but this missionary journey is something like 49 to 51 AD, again, depending on where you look. But let's see what all he does. This time he has Paul and Silas and Timothy, and they go to 21 locations. But what was his message? What was it that Paul was preaching as he went along? More or less, he always went and was reasoning with the Jews and the Gentiles. Oftentimes, you would see him go immediately to the synagogue where the Jews meet, and he would talk to them first, and then he would talk to the Gentiles. But he was always proclaiming why Jesus came to earth, and why he died, and why he was raised from the dead. And it's interesting that the word reasoning is used many times on the second missionary journey because the people now knew about Jesus. They knew what he had done, but they didn't necessarily understand why. So, Paul also talked to those who worshiped other gods and explained that there is one true and sovereign God. So then we have to ask the question, well, where all did he go and what did he do? And that's where we're going to look at. I'll again pop the map up on the screen, and I'll put a link so you can see it better in the description. So, they started out in Antioch. Now remember, there are two Antiochs. Syrian Antioch is where they are now, but there was also that Pisidian Antioch. Right now they're in Syrian Antioch. This picks up in chapter 15, verse 35. It says, Paul and Barnabas remained in Antioch, where they and many others taught and preached the word of the Lord. Now, they set out on this missionary journey. And remember, I said it was Paul and Silas and Timothy. What happened to Barnabas? Well, if you look at chapter 15, 36 through 41, you get the answer to that. If you remember, there was one person that came with Paul and Barnabas, and he left them whenever they went to Perga. Do you remember his name? It was John Mark. John Mark left and went back to Jerusalem. And now Barnabas says, let's bring John Mark with us again. And Paul says, no, we shouldn't. He abandoned us last time. And they had such a sharp disagreement that they separated. Barnabas took John Mark with him, and he went on his own journey. And Paul took Silas and Timothy, and they went on a different journey. So they didn't stick together. So as we go through these, I'm going to read the verses for you, and we'll talk a little bit about where they go. So from Antioch, they travel to Cilicia in verse 41. Then in chapter 16, to Derbe in verse 1, to Lystra 1 through 5. Now, you may remember Lystra from last time. That's where they stoned him, and they supposed him to be dead. Then to Troas, and that's in verse 7 through 10. Now, you probably remember a lesson that we did before, but at this point, the pronouns, remember us, we, they, them, those kinds of things, they change from he and them to we and us. So Luke is now joining in on the journey. He's now with them. So then they go from there to Samothrace in chapter 11, Neapolis, also verse 11, and then to Philippi. And I bet you've heard the name Philippi before. In fact, Paul would write a letter to the church in Philippi. We call it Philippians. So let's stop here for just a moment. There's a little bit more scripture about what happens in Philippi. And so we're going to look at this a little more carefully. They actually run into a demon-possessed girl. So let's read a little bit here. This is in chapter 16, verse 16 through 24. Let's read this. Once, when they were going to the place of prayer, we were met by a female slave who had a spirit by which she predicted the future. She earned a great deal of money for her owners by fortune telling. She followed Paul and the rest of us, shouting, "These men are servants of the Most High God who are telling you the way to be saved." She kept this up for many days. Finally, Paul became so annoyed that he turned around and said to the spirit, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to come out of her." At that moment, the spirit left her. When her owners realized that their hope of making money was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace to face the authorities. They brought them before the magistrates and said, "These men are Jews and are throwing our city into an uproar by advocating customs unlawful for us Romans to accept or practice." The crowd joined in the attack against Paul and Silas, and the magistrates ordered them to be stripped and beaten with rods. After they had been severely flogged, they were thrown into prison, and the jailer was commanded to guard them carefully. When he received these orders, he put them in the inner cell and fastened their feet in stocks. Why were they thrown in jail? That is an important question. Take some time with your family, talk about that. Why did they just get thrown in jail? And we'll discuss some more. I think that it was because Paul and Silas, they took away these men's ability to make money from this person, this girl who could predict the future because of her spirit, and they were mad. You took away our living. So they had them thrown into jail because they were frustrated about that. So then, they're in jail, and some interesting things happen to them while they're in jail. Let's look at this. This is verse 25 through 34, again in chapter 16. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God. Now remember, their feet are in stocks, and from what I understand of those stocks, they were not just to hold your feet still, but they put you in terrible positions that were painful. So they're at night praying and singing hymns to God while their feet are in stocks. And listen, the other prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly, there was such a violent earthquake that the foundations of the prison were shaken. At once, all the prison doors flew open and everyone's chains came loose. The jailer woke up, and when he saw the prison doors open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself because he thought the prisoners had escaped. But Paul shouted, "Don't harm yourself. We are all here." The jailer called for lights, rushed in, and fell trembling before Paul and Silas. He then brought them out and asked, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" They replied, "Believe in the Lord Jesus and you will be saved, you and your household." Then they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all the others in his house. At that hour of the night, the jailer took them, washed their wounds, and then immediately he and all his household were baptized. The jailer brought them into his house and set a meal before them. He was filled with joy because he had come to believe in God, he and his whole household. What just happened? There was an earthquake. It shook the foundations of the prison such that all the doors flung open and the prisoners' chains came loose. Now, let me ask you a question. The jailer, it says he drew his sword and was almost going to kill himself. Why is that? That's kind of a weird response whenever you say, the prisoners are gone, and he wants to do that. Why do you think that is? From what I understand, back 2,000 years ago, around when this was happening, it was 100% the jailer's responsibility to keep the prisoners in prison. And if they escaped, he would be punished with his life. So, it was usually a very brutal punishment. Knowing that, they would want to avoid that pain, and so a lot of times they would take care of it themselves because they knew what was coming. So, knowing that, and knowing that these men in the jail are now free, the doors are open, the chains are off, we can escape, no problem. But they stayed. How do you think that would have affected the jailer? Take a minute and talk about that. If you were responsible for these prisoners and they stayed whenever they could be set free, how would that influence you? And we'll talk some more. If I was the jailer, that would have influenced me tremendously, because these men literally saved my life. They could have left, but they didn't. I would have had to die if they left, and they didn't. I also suspect while they were singing and praying, the jailer heard them. It says the other prisoners listened. I suspect the jailer heard them as well. So whenever they stayed, having saved his life, he was probably ready to hear what they had to say. And I suspect that he had heard or heard about the slave girl that was chasing them around. These men are servants of the Most High God, showing you the way to be saved. So he says, what must I do to be saved? That is tremendous. They were set free, and ultimately they set this man free from sin by allowing he and his household to come to know God and be baptized into Christ. Now, after this, they leave from Philippi. And when they leave, the best we can tell, Luke seems to stay behind. Again, those pronouns, they change. So they go from there, chapter 17 now, to a town called Amphipolis, and then to Apollonia, and then to Thessalonica. Now, you've probably heard the word Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, because Paul writes 2 letters to the church that is in Thessalonica, and we call those 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. This is also a town where a huge riot erupted. The Jews did not like what Paul and Silas had converted. They didn't like that they had converted so many people to follow Jesus. So once again, they get together a whole band of people and they start a riot. And they told the city officials, these men who have caused trouble all over the world have now come here. Think about that for just a minute. He says, these men are causing trouble all over the world. I think it's safe to say that you and I know they were not causing trouble, but what we do know is their influence. It was known so widely around that area that these men could say, it's all over the world. That's pretty amazing. The gospel is spreading even though people are getting so angry about it. So they leave from Thessalonica and they go to a town called Berea. And that's in chapter 17, verse 10 through 14. Now the Bereans, they give us a very good example. They speak to the Bereans, and it says that the Bereans are of more noble character. And so they search the scriptures daily. In other words, they study their Bibles, basically. It wouldn't be the same Bible we have today, but what they had available. They searched the scriptures to determine if what they were telling them was true. That's a good example for us today to say, oh, I've never heard that before. Let me study and see if that's true or not. So that's the Bereans. And then they go from there to a town called Athens. Athens is in Greece. And you can read about that in chapter 17, verse 15 through 32. Quite a long section there. And Paul, in this town, he basically says, I perceive that you are a religious bunch of folks. You have these statues, these idols all around, and you have so many of them that I could barely count them, basically. And then he says, you even had one that had this inscription, to the unknown God. basically they're saying, in case we missed one, we've got this one that's unknown, because they believe they should be worshiping the gods. So Paul comes along and he preaches to them, and they are being persuaded, some of them are anyway, and he is really trying to tell them about this gospel. This that you worship as unknown, he says, I'm going to proclaim to you as known. So he speaks to them, and he talks about the resurrection of Jesus particularly. So they take him to a group of people called the Areopagus. The Areopagus is also a place. So it's a flat place where these people gather. And so the place and the people that gather there are one and the same. Now, many times we hear words like Areopagus and we go, I don't really know what that is, and we don't think about it. But let me give you an illustration. In today's world, the United States, we have a court that we call the Supreme Court of the United States. And that is the highest level of officials, those that make the laws. They look at our laws and they judge what should be right and wrong and so forth. And they try to make decisions for our country. It's the highest court of the land. From what I understand, the Areopagus is very similar to the Supreme Court. So Paul comes along and he's preaching about Jesus and the resurrection. And they say, we want you to come basically to the Supreme Court, and we want to listen to what you have to say. Can you imagine a Christian missionary being asked to come and speak to the Supreme Court today? And then some of them become convinced and follow Jesus too. This, speaking to the Areopagus, is a big deal. It's really pretty impressive that he gets the opportunity to go and do that, and that they listen to him, and some of them are convinced. Not all of them, but it definitely says some of them are convinced, and they're like, we'll hear you again about this. Now, they go from there, leaving from the Areopagus, and they start traveling further. They leave from Athens and they go to Corinth. This is in chapter 18, verse 1 through 17. Now, again, Corinth is is a town that received 2 letters. Their churches there, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, probably books of the Bible that you've heard of before. At this place, Paul meets 2 people, Priscilla and Aquila. And he works with them as he is laboring for the gospel. He's working with them because he makes tents and they make tents. And they say, okay, well, let's work together. He does this so that he can earn money while he is preaching, because you have to have money in this world in which we live to survive. And so Paul makes tents. That's how he earns a living. And while he is in Corinth making tents with Priscilla and Aquila, he is teaching and persuading the people in Corinth that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Unfortunately, the people in Corinth did not all listen, and I should say the Jews did not listen very well. Paul, it says that he shakes off the dust from his clothes in protest against them. Must be so frustrating that they wouldn't listen. But God then spoke to Paul one night, and he says, I promise you, you will be safe in this city. And so Paul was kept safe. Even after he appeared in court, he had been accused of illegal worship. So after he goes to Corinth, he keeps moving on to Caesarea. This is in chapter 18:18. And he gets there safely. God promised you're going to be safe, and he was safe. And there he cuts off all of his hair. He had taken a vow, and it was customary that they would shave their head in fulfillment of the vow that they had taken. It's probably because he was protected from danger. We don't really know for sure. But he goes from there to a town called Ephesus. Again, we know this when he wrote a letter to the Ephesians. You remember that book of the Bible. And then to Caesarea, 1822, and then to Jerusalem, also in 1822, and finally back to home base into Syrian Antioch in 1822. So I want you to watch this video. It will be in a link in the description above. It is not something that I can just post into this video, but it gives a very good overview of Paul's first and second missionary journeys. It's about 5 minutes long. It's from the Bible Project, and it's very good information, and it makes this very simple. So I want you to watch that whenever we're done here. But it's interesting to me that Paul's missionary journeys, his work, it takes him to many places, and he becomes attached to many different churches. And it was full, his trip, of fear and excitement and danger and pain and miracles and friendships and many signs from God. And what was accomplished by Paul? Ultimately, Paul was able to convert many, many people and encourage many churches throughout the land. So let me ask you this question. A couple of things I want you to talk about. What would have happened if Paul had not taken the message of God to all these places? Would we have Paul's words in our Bibles, the letters that he wrote? Would we understand about the love of God for his people? Would we understand the sacrifice necessary to bring others to God? It's a good question. So I have an activity for you while you're talking about this. I think you'll enjoy it. We're going to make an edible map, and you'll see what that's about in a minute. But think about Paul and what he did in spreading the gospel as you're making this edible map. And I'll explain more to you as we go over to the kitchen table and you see what that's all about. And don't forget, watch the video after you're done. That's in the description on YouTube. So we are going to make what we're going to call an edible map. So I have already made a giant chocolate chip cookie, which is going to be glorious. And then we have white chocolate chips, some Hershey's Kisses. Then I have vanilla icing, and I've got some that I made green with food coloring and some that I made blue with food coloring. And then I've got some Twizzlers that are a pull and peel, and I'll show you what each of these things is going to be for. So what we're going to do is take a map outline of the United States, and I'm going to make this cookie look something like the United States. Now, I know that there is Mexico to our south, and there is Canada to our north. I guess maybe it would be backwards as you see it. But we're going to go around the outside with the blue icing, and then I'm going to make some green icing places in the middle. Then we're going to have mountains with the Hershey's Kisses, and then our white chocolate chips will be cities. And then we're going to use icing to glue those down. And then what we're going to do is use our pull and peel Twizzlers basically as like a roadmap to each different place, and I'll explain that a little bit more as we go. But let me get the outline down, and then I'll come back and talk some more. I have my United States. It's not really perfect, but it's pretty close. But if you remember, there's kind of desert region in the Arizona, Nevada area, and it sort of follows north just on the west side of the Rocky Mountains. And then you have the shoreline, or the coast, I guess it would be, of the ocean, and that is much more green. Then you have the Appalachian Mountains that are on the eastern coast that sort of run through New England and down south. So what we're going to do now is use these white chocolate chips. We're going to say, this is the point of Texas. We're going to say Dallas is roughly right in here. This is not accurate, precise. That's okay. Anyway, so that's where we are. And I wanted to show you a couple of places that I have been to spread the gospel. I have been to South Dakota, which is somewhere in this vicinity, to a town called Sioux Falls. One time we got to go there on a mission trip, and we spread the gospel. It was in high school, I guess. We got to go, and we were encouraging a local church, and we were preaching about Jesus. We actually taught a VBS while we were there. This one won't be on the map. We're just going to put it at the very bottom of Texas. I got to go to Mexico one time, to Torreon, and we went down there to build a church building, and that was a very interesting experience. A few years ago, we went all the way up to Vermont, which is going to be up here in New England, in and around, they actually call it the Green Mountain State. So I'm just going to put it here. That's, again, I can't put it on top of a Hershey's Kiss. But those are places that I have been personally deliberately trying to spread the gospel. Now, we also have missionaries. We have one that is in Arizona. His name is Evan Tortacini. So we're going to put this kind of close to there. Again, it's just sort of a guess. as geographically, but he's in Arizona, and he preaches the gospel to the Native American people that are there, which is really neat. We have another one in Vermont. That's Kirk Israel. I already put one there because I've been there to visit him and encourage the church where he was at. Then we have another one in Media, Pennsylvania. We're going to put it on the other side of the mountains, and that is Russell DeGiorgio. So we have several people in the United States that are trying to build churches and trying to spread the gospel to those people that don't know it. And there are many places in the United States where there are not a lot of churches. The West Coast is one of those places. There's not a whole lot of churches over there. The New England area, even though we have 2 missionaries, we have them because there's not a lot of churches there. There's way more churches in Texas, and then across the middle, what we call the South, where Alabama, where our preacher Jason Moon is from. Tennessee, there's a Christian school in Tennessee. You've probably heard of it. It's called Freed Hardeman. In Arkansas, in this general area, Harding University. We have several of those things that are going for the church that are universities. So what I want to encourage you to do is talk about places that maybe you would like to spread the gospel. Maybe you and your family can go to visit one of our missionaries. Or we actually have one in Canada. I'm just going to put it at the top over here. In Camrose, Canada, there's David Friesen up in Canada. So that one represents him. Maybe you want to go to the Northwest, or maybe you want to go to Florida, or maybe you want to go somewhere just in the middle. I don't know. But where do you want to go and try to spread the gospel? Maybe it's just where we live. That's a very good thing to do as well. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take our pull and peel Twizzlers. Yeah, they're sticking in the package. And I'm going to peel one of these loose. And they're very sticky, so I'm going to see what I can do about getting them to come apart. Almost. Okay. Now, I'm going to take that and I'm going to split it down even further, and it's going to be my path to take me on my gospel mission. So, I'm going to go from Dallas up almost to South Dakota, where I have already been. So we're going to put one of those there, and then I'm going to put a few more of these down, and I'll come back and show you what that looks like too. So I've made my little roadmap of places that I have been. Why don't you, and this is going to be fun. This is actually also going to be a snack. It's something that you can eat later. Why don't you put together your own little USA map? And again, you can print something like this. I just found it on Google. Very easy to find a black and white USA map to give you an idea. So then you can make your own edible map and decide, where do we want to take the gospel? Maybe it's something that you've already done. Maybe some of you are from other parts of the country, and you can put wherever you're from, and you can say, I've been to, different places or whatever. So you can make your map. Everybody's map should look a little different. And then maybe, where do you want to try to go to be able to spread the gospel? And then hopefully you can take a picture of your map and you can put that in the comments. That'll be fun to share, so that we can see where everybody's been and maybe where they want to go. And I hope that you have fun doing this, but I also hope that it's something that will challenge you to say, we need to spread the gospel. We need to go and tell other people about Jesus. So I hope that you have enjoyed this, and I hope that you enjoy your cookie. I know I have. So there it is. Spread the gospel. Take Jesus with you everywhere you go. And I will see you again on Sunday.